All right, so today we're diving into the life of Jim Morrell, and we've got 3 YouTube interviews with him to help us. And I got to say, this guy's story is pretty remarkable.
It really is a story of resilience and really the power of faith. And also, the just amazing things that modern medicine can do these days.
Yeah, exactly. And we're going to cover it all, from, a really groundbreaking surgery that he had as a baby to how he lived a pretty surprisingly normal life for decades, right up through the emotional roller coaster of dealing with heart failure and then ultimately getting a life-saving heart transplant.
One thing that I think is really interesting about this story is how closely connected his faith and the support that he got from his family were to his whole medical journey.
Yeah.
And it really gets you thinking about, the choices we make when we're facing limitations.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start at the beginning. Jim was born with a heart defect called transposition of the great vessels. And I'll be honest, I had to look that one up. It basically means his circulatory system was backwards.
Yeah, so think of it like this. Instead of the oxygen-rich blood going to the body and the oxygen-poor blood, going back to the lungs to get more oxygen, it was the opposite for Jim. So his body wasn't getting the oxygen that it needed.
That's why he was what they called a blue baby then.
Exactly. And you can imagine how many problems that caused. He needed to be resuscitated frequently when he was a child. I can't imagine what his family went through.
Oh, gosh. I know that must have been just terrifying every time.
Yeah.
And this wasn't just something they could just kind of monitor and hope for the best. At just 6 months old, Jim had open heart surgery, the mustard procedure.
Yeah.
And he was actually the youngest child in Alabama to have this surgery at the time.
Wow, that's incredible. And, it was a really complex procedure. They basically rerouted his blood flow to try to correct the issue. And, this was groundbreaking stuff back then, but it wasn't a permanent solution.
And this is where things get really interesting. Years later, on Jim's 18th birthday, his surgeon called his mom completely out of the blue.
Yeah.
Just to ask if he was still alive.
Yeah.
The surgeon hadn't expected him to live that long.
I mean, that's kind of wild when you think about it. It speaks to, how much we've learned about cardiac care over the years. But also imagine being Jim, growing up, knowing that even your surgeon wasn't sure you'd made it to adulthood.
Right. Like, how do you even process that?
Yeah.
That would have to shape your whole outlook on life. But, despite all that uncertainty about his condition, Jim went on to live a really active life. He even talks about sneaking in some physical activities that he wasn't supposed to be doing.
Oh, yeah. He was young, full of life. And he was also really involved in his faith. And eventually he became a minister.
And, that dedication to his ministry comes through so strongly in these interviews. He talks about pouring himself into his work with that same energy that he used to put into, those forbidden physical activities.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if that drive, that focus on something bigger than himself, if that helped him cope with all the health challenges.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's like he channeled that same determination into his faith and serving others.
But then in his 30s, things took a turn. He started having what he calls rhythm problems with his heart.
Yeah, he describes it as this really unsettling feeling, like his heart would skip beats or pause for what felt like forever and then suddenly start up again. Can you imagine that anxiety? Just never knowing when your heart might decide to take a break.
No, that sounds really scary. And it wasn't just a minor inconvenience either. He ended up in the ER multiple times. In one interview, he even tells this story about being in the ER while his heart was actually stopping and starting. And one of his elders, who was there to support him, he was watching the heart monitor, and he just couldn't handle seeing Jim flatline, even though Jim was sitting right there talking to him.
Wow, that's incredible. The fact that Jim could stay calm while essentially watching his own heart malfunction. This says a lot about his faith and his inner strength.
Yeah, it really does. So these rhythm problems were clearly becoming a serious issue.
Yeah.
What did the doctors have to say about all this?
Yeah. Well, they confirmed that he was having arrhythmias, which are basically irregular heartbeats. And they recommended a procedure in the cath lab to try and fix the problem.
Okay, but this is where the complexity of his original heart defect comes in,
Right.
Because the mustard procedure that he had as a baby, it saved his life, but it also changed his anatomy so much.
Exactly. It made even routine procedures really complicated because his heart wasn't structured the way it normally is. And the doctors had a really hard time establishing a baseline for his condition. The numbers they were getting from the tests didn't always match up with how he was actually feeling and functioning.
Yeah, he even mentions walking to the hospital for one of these procedures. And the doctors were shocked that he could even walk.
Yeah.
Based on his test results, he should have been, like, incapacitated.
It really shows how medical data can be limited sometimes. There's that human element, that spirit
Yeah,
that you can't always measure.
absolutely. So they tried to treat these rhythm problems,
Hmm.
but the underlying issue, heart failure, it was becoming more and more obvious.
Right. And this leads us to a huge turning point in Jim's story, the realization that he needed a heart transplant.
A moment that he probably always knew might come, but actually facing it head on has got to be a whole other experience.
It really does, and it brings up so many questions.
Mhm.
How do you even process that kind of news? What goes through your mind when you realize you need a new heart to survive? We'll dig into all that more in part 2 of this deep dive.
We will, but before we go there, I'm curious, what stood out to you so far
Mm-hmm.
in Jim's journey? I mean, the resilience he's shown since he was a kid, the role of faith in his life, his dedication to his ministry. There's a lot to unpack here.
So we left off with Jim facing the reality that he needs a heart transplant.
Mhm.
And he's actually gone through a bunch of transplant evaluations at this point, which is like a whole series of tests and assessments
Mhm.
and to figure out if he's eligible and where he stands on the waiting list.
It's really fascinating to hear him describe these evaluations. It's not just like a physical checkup.
Yeah.
They're looking at your emotional and social support systems too.
Which makes sense when you think about it. A transplant is a huge life change.
Yeah.
And they want to make sure the person is really ready, physically and mentally, for all the challenges that come with it.
Yeah, for sure. And for Jim, it wasn't a simple process. He talks about going through 4 separate evaluations at different hospitals.
Yeah.
And because of, his unique anatomy from that mustard procedure, he was considered a borderline case,
Meaning?
meaning he technically met the requirements for a transplant.
Mm-hmm.
But his situation was a lot more complex than usual.
I see.
He even talks about trying to argue his way out of being hospitalized.
Yeah.
He wanted to go on a family trip that they had planned.
Yeah.
But the doctors were like, no, you got to be admitted. You're not going home without a new heart.
Oh, wow. So they were serious.
Yeah, they were not messing around. And can you imagine having your life put on hold like that?
I know. And then there's the waiting.
Oh, the waiting.
Yeah.
He was listed as status 1B, which means he needed a transplant urgently, but he could still wait at home.
Yeah.
But even with that status, he went 265 days without a single offer.
265 days.
Yeah.
Wow. That's got to be tough, mentally and emotionally. Just knowing you need a new heart, but there's nothing you can do about it.
Right. It's totally out of your control. And during that time, he was on this IV medication called Milrinone to help his heart keep working.
Okay.
He calls it his go-go juice because it gave his heart that extra boost.
Yeah.
But it wasn't a long-term solution.
Right. And he actually talks about how the medication could damage his heart muscle over time. So it was this trade-off, extending his life for now, but possibly causing problems down the road.
It's like a catch-22. These impossible choices that people in his position have to make.
Exactly.
But one thing that really stood out to me was how committed he was to staying active during this whole waiting period. He called it keeping his legs, because he knew that being physically strong was going to be so important for his recovery after the transplant.
That's smart.
Yeah, he knew a transplant wasn't a magic cure. It was a bridge to a new life. And he had to be ready to cross that bridge, so he walked miles every day, pushing himself even though he was tired and, dealing with all these limitations.
That's pretty inspiring.
It is. And then after almost 9 months of waiting, he finally got the call. It was May 15th, 2013, a date he remembers very clearly.
Oh, wow.
And he describes all these emotions hitting him at once, the excitement, the anticipation, but also the fear. His family rushed to the hospital, friends came to wait with him, and everyone was just holding their breath.
I can only imagine.
But then, hours later, they got the news that the heart wasn't a match. I know, it's heartbreaking.
Talk about an emotional roller coaster.
Seriously, going from so much hope to such disappointment and still not knowing what's going to happen next.
And it really makes you think about how complicated the whole transplant process is, even when you get to the top of the list.
Yeah.
There's so many things beyond your control.
Absolutely. It makes you appreciate organ donors and their families even more. Even in the midst of their own grief, they're giving this incredible gift.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And through it all, Jim's faith never wavered. He talks about finding strength in prayer and in the support of his loved ones.
It sounds like they really helped him through it.
They did. They helped him deal with all those difficult emotions and face each day with courage. And that resilience was put to the test again. Just 1 week after that false alarm, he got another call, another potential heart.
Wow.
And this time it was a match. May 22nd, 2013, the day his life changed forever.
That's incredible.
He talks about being prepped for surgery, saying those tearful goodbyes to his family, and being wheeled into the operating room, knowing there was no turning back.
It must have been a surreal experience.
It was the culmination of years of uncertainty and this leap of faith into the unknown.
And did he talk about how he was feeling at that moment?
He did. He said that even with all that pressure, he felt a sense of peace. He had made peace with the possibility that he might not survive the surgery, and he trusted that no matter what happened, he was in God's hands.
That's powerful.
It is. And after hours of surgery, he woke up with a new heart beating inside him.
I'm getting chills just thinking about it.
Me too. And what's really amazing is how quickly he recovered. He was awake and talking just 45 minutes after surgery, off the ventilator the next day, and walking incredible distances soon after.
It sounds like all that work he put into keeping his legs really paid off.
It did. It shows how the mind and body can work together to heal.
Yeah.
When they have the right support and that willpower to keep going.
Absolutely.
And, this second chance at life, it wasn't just about him. He and his wife were then able to adopt 3 little girls, expanding their family from 2 kids to 5.
Wow, what a beautiful outcome.
It's amazing how one organ donation can have such a ripple effect.
It's not just saving a life, it's creating new possibilities and new beginnings for entire families.
Right. But Jim's story doesn't end there. Driven by his own experiences, he started something called the Transplant Helper, the YouTube channel and an in-person ministry, where he helps others who are going through similar challenges.
So he took this incredibly personal and complex experience and turned it into something that could help others.
Exactly.
That's awesome.
It is. And he talks about how knowledge is power, especially in the transplant world. So he breaks down all that complicated medical jargon.
Making it easier to understand.
Yeah. And even empowering for patients and families.
I like that.
It's like he's saying you don't have to be a doctor to understand what's happening to you.
Right.
And one of the most important things he talks about is gratitude, not just for the gift of life itself, but for every single day, even the tough ones. He keeps emphasizing that these are days that he wasn't supposed to have.
It's such a powerful way to look at it.
It is.
Instead of focusing on what you've lost, you focus on what you've gained.
Exactly. He even says that before the transplant. He used to get frustrated when things didn't go his way. But afterwards, even the little things, like being able to go outside and feel the sun on his face, filled him with so much joy.
It's like that near-death experience, that brush with losing everything made him appreciate life on a whole new level.
Yeah, and that appreciation is what fuels his message of hope and resilience.
It makes sense.
And his advice to people who are newly facing a transplant is so powerful. He tells them to focus on what's coming, not on what's been.
Don't get stuck in the waiting.
Yeah, don't get bogged down in the what ifs.
Yeah.
Visualize yourself healed, thriving, living a life with purpose.
It's like mentally preparing for the future you're fighting for.
Mm-hmm.
And he also says that this positive outlook, it's not about ignoring the hard stuff. It's about choosing to believe in the possibility of a better tomorrow.
Right. He also talks about how important it is to have a community, to connect with other people who understand what you're going through.
Like support groups.
Yeah, online support groups, transplant centers.
Yeah.
Even just a friend who will listen without judgment. Having that network can make all the difference.
He's right.
And he's very open about how his wife and kids were his rocks during his transplant journey. Their love and support helped him through the hardest times. But he also recognizes that not everyone has that same level of support, which is another reason why he created the Transplant Helper, to be a resource for anyone who's feeling alone or overwhelmed.
That's really thoughtful.
It is. He created a space where people can share their stories, their fears, their triumphs, and know that they're not alone.
That sense of connection can be so powerful.
It really can.
It's a good reminder that we don't have to go through tough times by ourselves.
Yeah, there's strength in being vulnerable, reaching out and letting others support us.
Absolutely.
So as we head into the final part of our deep dive into Jim Morell's life, I'm curious to hear what you're thinking. What has resonated with you the most so far? What questions has this raised for you?
Yeah, it's amazing how he's taken, this deeply personal experience and turned it into a way to help others. His Transplant Helper platform is really inspiring.
It is. It shows you what you can do when you turn adversity into something positive.
And he talks about how knowledge is power, especially when you're dealing with something like a transplant. He breaks down all that complicated medical stuff and makes it easier to understand for everyone. Patients, families, even just anyone who's interested.
It's like he's taking away that fear of the unknown.
Exactly. You don't have to be a doctor to understand what's happening to you or your loved one.
And one of the most powerful things he talks about is gratitude. Not just for getting a second chance at life, but for every single day.
Even the bad ones.
Yeah, even the bad ones. He keeps saying these are days he wasn't supposed to have.
And that really changes your whole perspective, doesn't it?
It does.
Instead of thinking about what you've lost, you focus on what you've gained.
Exactly.
That's powerful.
He even talks about how before the transplant, he used to get frustrated by little things, And that's what fuels his message of hope and resilience.
That makes sense.
And his advice to people who are about to go through a transplant is really something. He tells them to focus on what's coming, not what's been.
Don't dwell on the past.
Right. Don't get caught up in the waiting and the what ifs. Visualize yourself healed, thriving, living a life with purpose.
Almost like you're already there.
Yeah.
And he makes it clear that this positive outlook, it's not about pretending everything's okay. It's about choosing to believe that things can get better.
And that hope can make a huge difference.
It can.
He also talks about the importance of community, finding people who understand what you're going through.
Yeah, like support groups.
Right, online support groups, transplant centers, even just a friend who will listen without judgment.
Having those connections is so important.
It really is. And he's very open about how much his wife and kids helped him through his transplant journey. Their support was everything.
That's beautiful.
It is. But he also knows that not everyone has that kind of support system, which is another reason why he created the Transplant Helper, to be there for anyone who's feeling alone or overwhelmed.
A safety net.
Exactly.
Let's sing.
He created a space where people can share their stories, their fears, their triumphs, and realize they're not alone in this.
And that can make all the difference.
It really can.
We all need to know we're not alone sometimes.
Absolutely.
Jim's story is a powerful reminder of that.
It is. So as we wrap up this deep dive into his life, what are your final thoughts?
I think what sticks with me the most is the power of resilience. Jim's story shows us that the human spirit can overcome incredible odds.
It's about finding strength, even when things are tough.
And choosing hope, even when you're facing adversity.
It's inspiring.
It is.
And it reminds us that our limitations don't have to define us.
Sometimes they can even help us live more fully.
Make us appreciate every moment.
Exactly.
If you're interested in learning more about Jim's story, check out the Transplant Helper on YouTube.
You can hear it from him directly and connect with a community of people who understand what it's like to go through a transplant.
And maybe even consider becoming an organ donor yourself. It's a decision that could give someone else a second chance at life.
Just like it did for Jim.
Until next time.
Keep diving deep.